Hey guys, tonight we return to a Europe without electric light, without warm water, a place where the thick stone walls are as cold as the commandments of the church itself. You can hear the bells echoing from the cathedral, mingling with the wind that slips through wooden shutters, and out there, beneath cloaks damp with mist, people are struggling to learn how to love in a world that sees the body as sin. This is an age in which no woman would ever wish to be born, a time when love is governed, desire forbidden, and even the act of touching another could be counted as a crime before God. So, before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if the stories I tell tonight offer you something of worth. And if you are listening somewhere in the middle of the night, tell me where you are from and what time it is where you are. Now turn off the light, wrap yourself beneath a warm blanket, and let us step gently together into tonight's journey. You open your eyes in darkness. Not the gentle kind of modern night, where a reach of the hand can find the light of a phone, but a darkness thick as a damp blanket, smelling of cold stone and incense that clings to the skin. In medieval Europe, the sun was your clock, the church your calendar, and the bell the only voice reminding you that the day still continued. You lived between two powers that could never be separated, God and the plough. One held your soul, the other your stomach, and neither left you much choice. People of that age were taught that the body was sin, and yet ironically it was through the body alone that would feel the presence of God. The church preached that flesh was the road to damnation, yet it spoke of Christ crucified, blood flowing, wounds open, an image far too human to be called holy. They were told to despise pleasure, but every Sunday they knelt before paintings of naked, suffering bodies and called it faith. It makes a certain sense. When you live in a world of rain, mud, and orders from above, contradiction is the only colour left. If you were a peasant, your body belonged first to God, then to your Lord, and only lastly, and barely, to yourself. You tilled another man's land, ate bread ground by another's mill, prayed in words written by hands you would never meet. Every breath was a gift from above. But if you felt a heat rise in your blood at the sight of someone in the market, forgive yourself. That was not affection, the priest said, but temptation from the devil. And the church had an entire catalogue of remedies for such desires: confession, self-flagellation, prayer, or marriage to someone you did not love in the name of avoiding sin. The strange thing is, the world truly believed that suppressing desire protected the soul, when in truth it only drove it inward, where it burned in other forms. People folded their longing into prayer, into dreams, into statues and rituals. The church might forbid you to embrace another, yet allow you to kiss the feet of a saint. A clever substitution indeed. And in that darkness, faith and fear bled together. A cough might be a chill, or punishment for lust. A nightmare might be hunger, or a demon's whisper. And if you asked a doctor, which meant a monk with a few Latin books, he would tell you the stars had shifted, or that you had eaten too much hot food. Perhaps a little smoke of herbs, a few days of silence, and a prayer to the Virgin would suffice. Simple enough. This world ran on delicate fears. Fear of hunger, fear of sin, fear of oneself. And yet, strangely, there was no despair. They believed every pain had purpose. A wound was a lesson, a thirst, a test. Even the longing for another's touch could be seen as a battle for the soul's salvation. No one called it misery, they called it virtue. And each morning, when the bells rang from the church tower, people rose, brushed the mud from their hands, and carried on, as though their bodies were debts to be paid. At times, looking back, you might think, they were so wretched. Ye, but had you lived among them, you might have seen that they also knew laughter. At a stolen glance during a festival, at a priest stumbling over his sermon, at a pig darting through a sacred procession. Humour was a kind of mercy, the last defence against a world too heavy with commandments. And in a life where the body was treated as a prison, those small moments, a breath, a touch, a shy smile, were proof that humanity had not yet been devoured by God, by the church, or by the dark. So when night fell upon Europe, it did not only shroud the churches and the fields, it settled over the mind, over the body, over every buried desire. Yet within each person, a small ember remained, something even theology could not smother. It was the instinct to live, to touch, to feel, to love. That which made humans, though branded as sinners, continue to breathe and smile within the darkness. But the darkness of the Middle Ages did not only cover the villages and the churches, it crept deeper into the one place from which no one could ever escape, the body itself. From the fear of the world outside, people began to learn the art of fearing what beat within their own chests. And so, as history turned its page on faith, the human body ceased to be a gift from God. It became the enemy of the soul. The first sermons of the early Christian fathers echoed across Europe like distant bells, repeating the same refrain. Every pleasure is a wound upon the soul. A small sentence, yet powerful enough to build an entire civilization of guilt. It began with St. Augustine, a man who had once lived a life of indulgence, then awoke in remorse. And from his private memory, the Church drew a universal truth. Humanity was taught that God created the body only to test the soul, that every moment of desire was Satan's hand, pulling them down to hell with a silken rope named pleasure. And so every touch, every breath, every fevered dream became a source of dread. The body, once a home, turned into a shackle. People grew afraid of what was natural, afraid of skin warming under another's gaze, afraid of vague dreams that rose in the dark, afraid even of their own heart beating too fast after prayer. In monasteries, the devoted learned to wake themselves at midnight to pray, not out of devotion, but to strangle a sinful dream before it could be born. In those days, theology became a kind of medicine for the soul. Every pleasure was a diagnosis. If you desired, it meant you were infected with Adam's poison. If you felt lonely, it was God's trial. And if you felt nothing at all, congratulations, you might already be dead, a state that some monks considered the closest one could come to holiness. They even advised believers to bathe less, eat plainer, sleep shorter, so that the body would weaken, and the soul, they claimed, would grow strong. But the irony was that the more people feared the body, the more they were haunted by it. They painted punishments on cathedral walls, bodies torn, pierced, melted, and called it religious art. They condemned lust, yet sculpted every tendon and muscle of Christ with tender devotion. Perhaps they did not dare to love, but they spent their lives gazing upon the suffering of flesh with a kind of indirect, safe moral pleasure, a sanctioned form of desire. The body by then was no longer the self. It was a thing to be governed, disciplined, and punished. In monastic journals, one man confessed to wrapping his thighs in nettles so he would not dare think of women. Another scourged himself with leather whips whenever the memory of a girl's hair returned to him from the fields. These were not exceptions. They were emblems of the age, an age that measured holiness by one's ability to despise oneself. Medieval Europe lived within that paradox, to believe oneself made in God's image, and yet be taught that the image itself was filthy. They prayed for deliverance from the flesh, yet could never stop being obsessed with it. Life became an endless negotiation between soul and body, between faith that longed to rise and instinct that longed to touch. From a modern gaze, we might smile. How strange! A civilization spending centuries trying not to feel. But perhaps they were only doing what all humans do, trying to control what they could not understand. They were not afraid of desire itself. They feared the helplessness that came when they faced it. And thus the darkness of before, the outer darkness, became the inner one. No longer something that fell upon rooftops, but something that clung to flesh, seeping into every thought. A soft, persistent shadow, making people tremble with fear, and yet strangely enchanted by it. For sometimes, in resisting the body, one remembers most vividly what it means to live within it. And when humankind had learned to fear its own flesh, the next question arose, naturally, almost inevitably. If pleasure is sin, then why did God make us with the hunger for it? In the Middle Ages, such a question did not lead to philosophy, but to theology. And theology, as always, had an answer both beautiful and terrifying. It was all because of original sin. They believed that when Adam and Eve bit into the apple, they did not merely eat forbidden fruit, they swallowed desire itself. From that moment onward, every human being was born with the stain of ancestral guilt. None were innocent, not even a crying newborn. The thirst for knowledge that Adam chose, according to doctrine, had opened not only the gates of understanding, but also awakened in humankind a fire that could never be extinguished. Lust. The Church Fathers said that knowledge and desire were twin rivers flowing through the same vein. One made mankind wise, the other dragged it toward ruin. And humanity's tragedy was that the two could never be separated. Body, soul, and mind were bound together in a cruel covenant. To live was to sin. To preserve the species was to reenact the fall. Every child born was, in the Church's eyes, living proof of their ancestors' betrayal. Thus semen, the beginning of life, was seen as the emblem of sin. It was the fluid of the fall, carrying within it the memory of lost Eden. In medieval religious writings, many priests claimed that, with every emission, a man loses a piece of his soul, a thought both solemn and strange, but to them it was truth. And for women who carried and birthed life, their pain was the divine punishment laid upon Eve, and through her, upon all womankind. Every cry in childbirth was a reminder, you are paying for the first sin. Zor, no angel came to ease the pain, only whispered prayers in the dark, that the child might live, and if it died, that its soul might be baptized in time, lest it drift forever in limbo. A woman in those days gave birth not only in fear of death, but in fear of God. It was a cruel paradox. The very act that sustained life was condemned as the reenactment of sin. A child was born and immediately rushed to church to be cleansed, as though its first breath had already been an act of disobedience. Baptism then was not merely a rite of faith, it was humanity's attempt to erase the evidence of desire, a mark that could never truly be erased. The medieval world lived under that haunting conviction that every vein, every breath, carried traces of Adam's fall. At one time, theologians even debated whether God could create a child without pleasure. Some insisted yes, by divine will alone. But most admitted what they could not deny. Even if God wished it, humans could not. They were chained to flesh by the very links they themselves had forged. And when sin had been planted deep into the blood, the Church no longer needed to rule by force. It required only one reminder, that every joy carried a price, a touch, a kiss, a moment of ecstasy. All were evidence of the weakness that must be redeemed through prayer. Yet still people loved. They touched. They brought forth children. Because even beneath punishment there remained a spark of the first instinct, something no doctrine could erase. The church called it sin. The peasant called it life. The mother called it nature. And the lover called it warmth against the coldness of the world. And so, from the fear of the body, humanity passed into a deeper fear, the fear of its own blood. They believed that within their veins flowed not only the inheritance of Eden, but a curse that could never be washed away. They lived, loved, and died, believing that inside them burned a hidden flame, the ember of Adam, silently consuming every generation forever. And when mankind came to believe that sin flowed in the blood itself, every gesture, every breath became evidence awaiting judgment. A glance was no longer innocent. Even a dream could be a crime. Yet sin, though invisible, still needed a place to be confessed, a ritual through which people could believe themselves forgiven. And so, in that age of trembling faith, a small room was born, a chamber where the soul was washed with words while the body was stripped bare by silence. It was the birth of confession, the moment when darkness became a courtroom and the human voice a blade. Imagine it, a narrow chamber, walls damp with centuries of breath, air thick with the scent of wax and incense. You kneel, not before light, but before a wooden screen with a single small opening. On the other side, a low gravelled voice, the voice of God's authority, asks, "Whom have you touched?" A question meant to save, yet designed to expose. Every answer, every trembling word that leaves your lips cuts not the flesh but the shame beneath it. In name, confession was the cleansing of the soul. In practice, it was a spiritual dissection, a ritual surgery of language. Every desire had to be named, categorized, recorded. No pleasure could pass without its matching sin. Fornication, self-abuse, unnatural act, nocturnal emission. There were priests who spent entire lives writing manuals for confessors, catalogues of sexual sins so meticulous they read like handbooks of forbidden pleasure disguised as theology. And thus arose the great paradox. In its mission to destroy desire, the church became the place where desire was spoken of most. Inside the confessional, the body no longer existed, yet its every detail was evoked through holy language with unsettling precision. The priest standing in for God listened to tales of secret nights, of fleeting touches, of dreams the faithful were taught to fear. For the sinner, it was a moment both terrifying and relieving. Terror, because the most private corners of the soul now had divine ears. Relief, because to speak was to believe oneself cleansed. Yet perhaps, in that moment, humanity discovered something new. The power of confession itself. A peasant, nameless and poor, could stand before a man of sacred authority and whisper things he would never dare to say in daylight. In darkness, sin became story, and story became survival. As for the priest, the listener, the judge, the vessel of God, he too was trapped within the paradox. He was keeper of the village's secrets, the one who knew who loved whom, who had strayed, who could not resist their own nature. He knew everything, and that made him both holy and dangerous. Many chronicles tell of priests who used that power to manipulate their flock, turning repentance into control, guilt into a web of authority and desire. For the church, confession was never only devotion, it was surveillance of the soul. When people are made to name their sins, they also surrendered their freedom. No sword was needed, only whispers. One misplaced word, one forgotten lie, could condemn a soul, not to death, but to a lifetime of private torment. And yet, confession endured. regarded as an act of faith, even grace. Trapped between instinct and fear, people sought it as their only redemption, because if sin could not be spoken, it would fester in silence, like a fever that never breaks. In a strange, almost tender way, the confessional became the one place where humans could be truly honest. There, they admitted what they could not admit to the world, that they were weak, that they desired, that they were merely human. And perhaps between those two cold panels of wood, in the flicker of candlelight and trembling breath, there were tears, not only of the penitent but of the priest himself, fighting the same temptations, bound to hide them beneath his holy robes. In medieval history, confession became a ritual both sacred and fleshly, both liberation and bondage. It proved that even in an age that taught humanity to despise the body, people could never stop speaking of it, thinking of it, or seeking forgiveness simply for having felt it. And so, if the body was where sin resided, then the confessional was where sin learned to speak. And like every story ever told in darkness, it never truly ended. It was only whispered again, softly once more. And when every sin had been spoken aloud in that narrow chamber, when the priest sighed and granted absolution, and the penitent stepped out with hollow eyes, there still remained one thing that could not be cleansed. The body went on living. It still pulsed, still breathed, still longed. You could pray for the fire in your blood to cool, but the body did not obey. And so, when religion failed to cure the disease of the flesh, mankind turned to another kind of power, medicine, not the kind we know today, but a strange half-science, half-sorcery, where physicians and magicians were often the same man. In rooms heavy with smoke and incense, amid the pounding of pestles and the murmur of boiling herbs, medieval healers tried to decipher what the church could only name as lust. They believed the human body was made of 4 humours: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. When these fell out of balance, people were seized by inexplicable urges. Desire, they thought, was not a sin, but a symptom of humoral disturbance. Looking up to the night sky, they read the stars as modern doctors read blood tests. If Venus shone brightly, desire would rise. If the moon was pale and clouded, the body turned cold. Celestial bodies, they said, ruled pulse and breath and the tides of yearning. A wise physician might consult your star chart before prescribing herbs, river baths, or an extra week of prayer. According to the theory of humours, women were moist and cold, while men were hot and dry. In other words, men were quick to burn, women prone to melancholy. It was a way for medicine to sanctify prejudice, turning physiology into fate. A woman too moist was called wanton. A man too dry was advised to drink wine steeped with the herb aphrodisia to rekindle the fire of life. It sounded scientific, yet it was little more than astrology wrapped in Greek philosophy. They believed the body, like the earth, had its seasons: the spring of pleasure, the summer of impulse, the autumn of fatigue, and the winter of decay. And like nature, it needed balancing. A doctor might advise, if desire rises too strong, eat lettuce, bathe in cold water, and avoid looking at the full moon. If you grow weak in passion, take egg yolks, ginseng root, or powdered stag's blood. No one truly knew if any of it worked, but faith itself was the strongest medicine. The medieval world ran on that fragile alloy of faith and pharmacology. Where the church called pleasure sin, physicians called it imbalance. Where priests prescribed prayer, healers prescribed mandrake root. And sometimes both stood side by side, one tending to the soul, the other to the flesh, both believing they served the same God. Old medical manuscripts still carry their curious advice, half rational, half mystical. A cold woman should sleep near fire and listen to soft music. A man too heated should walk under the moonlight. Some doctors recommended charms to banish lust. Carry a sachet of thyme leaves mixed with rooster ash, or slip a relic bone beneath your pillow. And if none of these worked, they would simply sigh and say, "Perhaps God wishes you to learn endurance." To modern ears, all this sounds absurd, but in that age it was the only language available to describe desire, something forbidden yet impossible to extinguish. Science was too young, so people built bridges with theology and astrology. A man kept awake by erotic dreams was not a patient, but a soul under trial. A passionate woman was not sent to a doctor but to a confessor. Some manuscripts even included a section for the clergy, instructions on how to remain pure amid temptation. One piece of advice read, "Do not gaze upon a woman for more than 3 seconds. If desire stirs, plunge your hands into cold water. If it persists, pray and lie face down upon stone until the fever subsides." There was no better medicine than exhaustion. Such was the Middle Ages, a time when the body was explained through myth, and myth was prescribed as medicine. Between the Psalms and the herb books, humanity wandered in search of an answer to the same eternal question. How can one live within the body without becoming its prisoner? And so, between priest and physician, between prayer and potion, desire endured, smouldering, stubborn like a coal beneath ash. No sin could quench it. No remedy could cure it. Only humanity, trembling and curious, kept naming what it felt, hoping that by naming it they might find peace. But in truth, with every attempt to understand it, desire only grew, quietly, endlessly, like a pulse still beating beneath the robes of virtue. And while learned physicians in long robes charted the stars to diagnose the ailments of soul and humour, outside the village gate there thrived another kind of medicine, quiet, instinctive, and far more effective. It did not rest on scripture or Greek philosophy, but on intuition and what grew in the garden. They called it the art of the cunning folk, the midwives, the healers who worked with hands and scent, and the belief that love, like illness, could be brewed. In their worn cloth satchels were no treatises of Galen, only dried mandrake roots, crushed rose petals, sprigs of rosemary, and small jars of thick honey. Nothing mystical, only ordinary things held by those who understood the power of smell, taste, and hope. For in the medieval world, love was not chance. It was a chemical stirring of the soul, something that could be kindled, cooled, or made to forget a face. The midwives, who lived on the border between medicine and magic, knew this better than anyone. They did not only deliver children, they delivered love. They knew when to add a drop of honey to calm a boiling heart, and when to stir black pepper into wine to wake a sleeping desire. To them, affection could be cooked, so long as one knew the measure, and as they like to say, knew who was watching when you drank. It sounds like folklore, but to medieval people, it was fact. Love potions were not fantasy, they were part of daily life. Some were brewed to make affection bloom, others to keep a husband faithful, or to make the heart forget a betrayer. Folk manuscripts recorded the recipes: mandrake root steeped in red wine, honey mixed with goat's milk, or the ashes of a lover's hair scattered into ale, all whispered over by candlelight with prayers to St. Valentine. That world had no tinder, no Shakespearean sonnets, only small vials that carried the scent of earth, bitterness, and hope. They believed that if one drop could soothe fever, another could quicken the pulse, and sometimes it truly worked, not through magic, but through faith. The drinker believed they would love, and so they did. But behind every potion lay danger. A mild dose might warm the body. A stronger one could bring delirium, even death. Mandrake, that human root said to scream when torn from the ground, contains powerful alkaloids that cause hallucination, paralysis, and cardiac arrest. The medieval folk did not know this. They only saw someone faint in strange rapture and believed love has taken hold. In remote villages, the midwife was also the witch, counsellor, and sometimes judge of morals. A wife might come seeking a charm to hold her husband. A young girl might ask for a draught to make a man forget her. And in a world where the body was branded as sinful, these peasant women became the keepers of forbidden knowledge, guardians of desire itself. It is no wonder, then, that many of them were later called witches. It took only a man to feel his heart stir after a woman's honeyed wine, and they would whisper, "She bewitched me." In those days, love could not be natural. It had to be sorcery or sin. And like all things uncontrollable, it was feared. Yet there was beauty in that fear. People still believed love could be born from the smallest things. A petal, a drop of honey, a handful of earth. Not because they were superstitious, but because they understood a truth even modern science admits. Love is chemical. Only, where we have laboratories, they had firelight. Where we have glass flasks, they had cups of wine. Where we have therapists, they had midwives. Women who mixed feeling, herb, and faith with rough hands. Some died from love potions. Many hearts broke when they failed, but thousands lived softer lives simply because they believed they were loved. And in an age when the church taught that flesh was sin, those tiny bottles were acts of gentle rebellion. For perhaps the medieval folk knew what we often forget. Not all magic is illusion. Sometimes a single drop of honey on a cold night is enough to make us believe that love still exists. And when the love potions had been brewed, when honey, mandrake, and whispered prayers had dissolved into one sweet dream, reality always returned, cold, rough, and smelling faintly of iron and duty. For in medieval Europe, no matter how many herbs love was boiled with, it could not alter a single truth. Marriage was never about the heart, but about land, honour, and bloodline. And when the wedding day came, no one asked if the bride loved, only if her father agreed. A medieval wedding had no white gown, no flowers. It had contracts thick and sealed, read aloud before a priest, witnessed by both families. Marriage was a transaction, sometimes political, sometimes agricultural, a covenant that bound borders and surnames rather than souls. The bride and groom, perhaps strangers until that morning, stood smiling before God, knowing their lives had just been bartered in the name of duty and respectability. In the writings of the Church, marriage was called a holy sacrament, yet it was also a carnal obligation, not merely permitted but required, to bear children, to avoid fornication, to fulfill one's divine role. And like all obligations, it could be supervised. In many villages, the wedding night was not private. Relatives, sometimes even the village elder, stood outside the door listening. The creak of a bed frame, the stifled cry, all served as sacred proof that the union had been properly sealed. Among nobles, the ritual was even more official. White linens were laid upon the bed to be inspected at dawn. A single stain of blood meant virtue, legitimacy, and family honour. Without it, everything could collapse, the marriage annulled, the dowry reclaimed, and the girl, even if innocent, confined or sent to a convent. One night, one drop, one reputation, a fragile trinity upon which entire dynasties rested. In some centuries, marriage was even witnessed publicly, not in horror, but as rite. The bedding ceremony spread across Europe. After the vows, the bride and groom were escorted to their chamber, while witnesses gathered round, chanting prayers as the couple removed their shoes. When the door closed, the prayers turned to laughter, the murmurs of celebration mixing with the faint sounds within, a strange harmony of faith and flesh. Sex, within marriage, was not joy but duty to God. Priests reminded couples that each union was an act of service, to be performed not for pleasure but for procreation. Church manuals listed forbidden nights. Fridays, the day of Christ's Passion, Lent, Easter, and never within a church. And if one slipped and sinned on a holy day, confession awaited, for God hears all things. But life, of course, refused to obey theology. Among the arranged and the loveless, real affection sometimes bloomed, shy, secret, trembling like a candle in the wind. Some couples learned to turn duty into closeness. Others endured a lifetime beside someone they did not love, yearning only once to be touched for themselves, not for lineage or salvation. And then there were the unlucky, the brides whose sheets showed no blood, the wives who bore no sons. Their bodies became evidence of guilt. They were questioned, blamed, examined. For in that world a woman's flesh was never her own. It belonged to her husband, the church, and the eyes of the community. To us, it seems cruel. But to the medieval mind it was natural order, as steady as harvest and holy days. Every body had its assigned role, man to sow, woman to bear. Feeling too deeply was temptation, and so, even when a bride trembled on her wedding night, they believed heaven smiled, because duty had been fulfilled. Yet if one listens closely through the cold stone walls of castles, there are moments, a soft laugh, a whispered word, a breath that is real. It is in those small forbidden fragments that humanity stirs, a touch without obligation, a glance without witness. And perhaps in that fleeting instant they were truly free, if only for one night. And so, when the wedding night was over, when the white sheets were hung in the sun and honour certified by a dry trace of blood, married life in the Middle Ages began. Not with love, but with a schedule. For even in the most private of acts, the Church demanded the final word. After teaching mankind when to marry, it went further, dictating when one might love, not by feeling, but by the calendar of heaven, by day of the week, by season of the year, by the moods of God. And so across medieval Europe, even the touch between husband and wife was governed by what might be called a liturgical calendar of desire. Friday, forbidden, for that was the day Christ was crucified. Sunday, forbidden, for that was his day of rest. Lent, Advent, Christmas, Easter, forbidden. When all prohibitions were counted, the permitted days of love amounted to scarcely 1/3 of the year. If the wife was pregnant, menstruating, or newly delivered, the couple must abstain. Sex became a ritual confined by the clockwork of the soul. It sounds absurd, but to the medieval mind it was serious theology. They believed each act of flesh carried supernatural weight. Performed on the wrong day, it could mark the child with sin, a squinting eye, a twisted hand, or worse, a crooked soul. There existed entire manuals, thick as farmers' ledgers, detailing which days to avoid, which positions were acceptable, even what thoughts one should hold during the act, all written, ironically, by men sworn to lifelong celibacy. In a famous 13th century sermon, one priest declared, "Married couples may come together on Tuesday, for that was the day God made the plants, but not on Friday, for that was the day he bled." Strange logic, yes, but it revealed the age's deepest obsession, the transformation of passion into timetable. People lived by the sound of church bells, and they loved by the rhythm of hymns. And of course, when pleasure is forced to keep a schedule, it will always find a way to escape it. by candlelight in roadside inns, in stables, in gardens, or on stormy nights unseen by eyes divine, people sought again the feeling the church called sin. They feared, and still they did it. For if every embrace required permission, what remained of love's spontaneity? Surviving letters speak of that defiance written in trembling ink. I know this night is forbidden, but I miss you too much. Marginal notes hidden between psalms confess the wish to touch a beloved hand without looking over one's shoulder. And in quiet hours, when the bells were silent and only the wind moved through the shutters, perhaps thousands were committing the same crime. They were loving after hours. Prohibition only sharpens desire. No one understood that better than the medieval soul. Alongside the long list of forbidden days, there grew folk secrets to bend the rules. Midwives whispered to brides, "If you truly love each other, meet under the new moon. God will be busy watching the sun and will not see." In some places they said, "If you make love in the rain, the angels will close their eyes for fear of the thunder." And so, within every storm there may have been as many prayers as moans, mingling in the dark. That was the beauty of the age. Even bound by chains, people found ways to live. They slipped through the cracks of holiness, carrying love with them. A husband might pretend to go and pray, only to meet his wife in the stable. A wife might lower her eyes beneath her veil during Mass, whispering to herself, "Tonight I will not be afraid." The church could command the calendar, but never the heart. Love crept through the shutters, into folk songs and the scent on a collar. It grew like grass between stones, trampled but never destroyed. And when dawn came, the bells rang again. Everyone returned to their roles: farmer, wife, believer. No one spoke of the night before, as if it had never been. Yet in the drowsy sleep after morning prayer they smiled, knowing that for one brief moment they had loved not by God's calendar, but by their own. Amid those secret nights when love slipped past the tolling of church bells, when desire stole brief moments outside the calendar of holiness, there remained another darkness, heavier, quieter, and without a name. For though people could outwit the laws of God, they could not escape the laws of men. In the medieval countryside, where land belonged to the Lord, fields to the castle, and peasants were only shadows moving upon soil they did not own, even the wedding night, the one night a poor couple might believe was truly theirs, was not always their own. Legends whisper that in certain corners of France and England there existed a privilege called droit du seigneur, the Lord's right. They said that if a peasant girl were to marry, her lord might claim the right to spend her wedding night with her before her husband did. No one dared to question. No one dared to resist. For to the villagers the Lord was nearly divine, keeper of their land, their taxes, sometimes their very breath. Historians still debate whether that right ever truly existed, or whether it was a symbol of fear. No royal charter or legal document records it, and yet the whispers persisted, in folk songs, in sermons, in the way silence fell over a wedding feast when the castle lights burned late on the hill. Perhaps the rite was never written, but the fear of it was real, and sometimes what people believe can wound more deeply than what is real. Imagine it. A small wedding in a damp village, the ale spent, the guests gone. The bride trembles in the darkness of a wooden hut, while outside footsteps echo, slow, deliberate, belonging to the man who owns everything. Each knock on the door sounds like a verdict. The young husband, a tenant with soil still caked under his nails, can do nothing but bow his head. And she, wrapped in coarse linen and choking on fear, prays only one thing: Lord, let him forget me tonight. The cruelest part was not whether it happened, but the silence surrounding it. For when something is called a rite, resistance becomes a sin. The wedding night, the beginning of 2 lives, became a test of obedience. In a world where chastity was currency, a powerful man could take not only a woman's body, but her family's honour with a glance. In some villages, people told of a virgin tax paid to avoid such nights, a goat, a sack of grain, a single coin, ransom for the right to be left alone. It was a strange, cruel superstition, a tax to keep one's body, as though the body too were property to be reclaimed. Even love, the most private of possessions, became a debt. Some accounts tell of priests stepping in to protect the bride, provided the family offered an additional tithe to the church. Everything had its price, even purity. And thus the peasant's wedding night became a quiet terror passed from generation to generation. No one knew how many women were truly taken. All knew that the threat alone was enough to keep them docile. That fear sank deep. Centuries later, plays in France and Scottish ballads still spoke of the Lord's wedding night, the young bride summoned, the powerless groom. It was not merely about lust, but about class, about ownership absolute, where the poor man's body became proof that he owned nothing, not even himself. Yet the most haunting thing was not the act, but the acceptance. People prayed longer, bowed lower, convincing themselves that submission was survival, that endurance was virtue. A bride rumoured to have been called upon might vanish into a convent, not out of shame, but to turn her silence into atonement. And, as with all things in the Middle Ages, the Church wrapped it in theology. They said, every suffering is a test of faith. So even when a wedding night was stolen, the victim was told to be grateful, for perhaps God was testing her soul, a gentle voice saying something unspeakably cruel. And so, when we read those stories now, what chills us is not the violence, but the resignation. A world where fear became tradition and submission was called virtue. And beneath the flicker of candles in the chapel, people continued to pray, not to be loved, only to be spared from being called in the night. When the prayers of the wedding night had faded into darkness, when the knock of the Lord had become only a shadow in memory, the last offence a medieval woman possessed was something thinner than silk, raised to the height of a sacred symbol, the hymen. If a man's power lay in sword and soil, then a woman's power, cruelly enough, rested in a single drop of blood. One small drop, yet enough to decide honour, fate, even the survival of an entire house. It sounds absurd, but in the Middle Ages, chastity was a kind of moral currency. It was not merely a matter of flesh, but a spiritual asset guarded by the village, the church, the community alike. A pure maiden was like an unminted coin, untarnished by touch. One rumoured to have been touched, even falsely, was deemed devalued. And so, in a world where marriage was a transaction, the female body became the receipt, stamped proof of loyalty. The bitterness was this, that value did not lie within the woman herself, but in how others saw her. She was not permitted to love, to test, or to err. She was only allowed to preserve, like merchandise awaiting delivery. Her duty was simple and cruel. On her wedding night, to lie still, endure pain, and leave behind the proof of purity upon the white linen. That drop of blood, if it appeared, was a certificate of virtue. If it did not, whether by rumour or by the mere nature of her body, she might be condemned, humiliated, or cast away. For centuries, people believed the hymen to be God's seal, guarding virtue, opened only by a husband. None understood that what they worshipped was a biological misunderstanding. Many women were born without it. Others tore it in childhood without ever knowing. But in that world, science had no voice, only faith. And faith, once mingled with power, becomes a weapon. 13th century texts describe in chilling detail the verification of virginity, examined by hand, by candlelight, even by silver mirror. In some villages, a midwife, the so-called matron of honour, acted as public witness. If the bride showed no trace of blood, the woman might prick her own finger, staining the sheet to preserve a semblance of honour. No one spoke of it, but all knew. A violent ritual wrapped in words of sanctity, purity, virtue, grace. And the true tragedy was this. Even blood could not save a woman if someone wished her guilty. A rumour, a glance, a single disappointing night, any could doom her. She might be dragged into the square, accused of fornication, and shut away in a convent to repent. A crime without proof and without escape. Virginity became a collective obsession. Priests preached that the body was the gate of sin and chastity the only road to heaven. They painted the Virgin Mary as the impossible ideal, mother yet untouched, and millions of women were told to live by her image, to endure pain without cry, to love without acknowledgement. Folk tales speak of desperate attempts to preserve purity. Pine resin charms, holy water steeped with roots, whispered prayers for death before marriage, for to die untouched was to ascend clean to paradise. In the coldest sense, the price of purity was death, and if chastity was currency, who were its bankers? Men, those who made the laws, performed the tests, judged and profited. They could visit brothels, father bastards, sin 1,000 times, and still be absolved by the phrase, the weakness of men. A woman, by contrast, needed only one suspicion to lose everything. Injustice wrapped in scripture, sanctified as virtue, taught as nature. Worse still, medieval Europe both feared and worshipped women's blood. Menstrual blood was impure, yet virginal blood was holy. Both flowed from the same body, one reviled, the other revered. A world that demanded women bleed to prove they were clean. So if one were to ask, what is the price of purity? The answer would be pain unspoken. The pain of the wedding night, the pain of scrutiny, the pain passed from mother to daughter like a hereditary silence. And that perhaps was the truest tragedy of the Middle Ages, that while they built cathedrals in honour of the Virgin, they also built a world that crucified every woman who resembled her. A pious society that forgot compassion. A world that believed purity must be proven by blood, until nothing remained pure except the blood itself. And once a world had learned to measure purity in blood, the next step was to preserve it in iron. If a drop of blood could redeem a woman's honour, then how could one prevent it from being stolen before the wedding night? The answer, at least in the collective imagination, was the chastity belt, the perfect emblem of obsession, fear, and male authority forged into cold metal. In truth, no reliable evidence suggests that medieval women ever truly wore such iron devices locked with keys, yet that did nothing to kill the legend, it only made it immortal. In 15th century woodcuts, in soldiers' tales brought back from the Crusades, men spoke of locking up their wives before going to war, fearing betrayal and keeping the only key. Real or not, the idea took root, becoming a cultural truth, for what people believe can be more terrifying than what they do. The chastity belt in myth was more than a mechanism. It was a declaration of ownership. It said, a woman's body is not her own. It belongs to her husband, to the honour of her house, to the order of God. Each imagined click of metal did not merely imprison flesh. It caged the soul, turning desire into sin, freedom into danger. And behind that gruesome myth lies a quiet irony. The chastity belt was never meant for use. Most so-called medieval belts displayed in museums were crafted centuries later, during the Renaissance or the prudish Victorian age, when people were both enchanted by the past and uneasy about sex. They were artifacts of imagination, made not to confine women but to tell stories. Props of iron for a fantasy of control. What was truly frightening was never the metal, but the idea behind it. Even without real locks, women lived bound by invisible ones, forged from sermons, gossip and shame. When a husband went away, he needed no iron belt, only a village that watched. The neighbour would whisper, the priest would inquire at confession, the mother would remind her daughter, even when you walk outside, walk as if you were praying. Surveillance became ritual, womanhood became custody. In medieval art, chastity belts were often drawn as jokes. Rabbits, monkeys, even priests crowded the margins of woodcuts, fumbling for the key, a blend of lust and hypocrisy. In the margins of monastic manuscripts, one finds small sketches of women girdled in iron, captioned in Latin, Custodia Morum, guard the morals. Yet the phrase could just as easily mean imprison instinct. Both readings are true and both are tragic. The chastity belt, even as a symbol, revealed something deeper. Men's fear of women's desire. Fear that women might choose, might crave, might love without permission. If chastity upheld order, then female passion threatened to unmake it. So women had to be locked away, if not by iron, then by the belief that wanting love was shameful. The irony, of course, is that during the very centuries obsessed with purity, erotic culture quietly flourished. People carved bawdy scenes of monks and nuns, wrote ribald jokes into manuscripts, copied scandalous tales to pass around taverns. Even as society tightened its grip, desire seeped through every crack of morality. Perhaps the chastity belt was only a metaphor for that truth. The more you try to lock desire away, the more it grows. So when we look upon that belt today, we see not an instrument of torture, but a mirror, reflecting a world desperate to control what it could not comprehend. The medieval mind trusted in God, in blood, in iron, anything to reassure itself that order remained intact. But what it truly feared was not sin, it was freedom. And that sound of metal, if you listen long enough, does not come from iron at all. It comes from within, from the echo of phrases still whispered centuries later. A good woman must behave. She must be modest. She must be silent. Those words are the real chastity belt still clinging to the ribs of our thinking, proof that the most dangerous prisons are never made of steel, but of the belief that one must stay pure by someone else's standard. And after centuries of locking desire behind iron faith and holy fear, humanity began to discover another way to love, one that needed no touch. When the body was branded sinful and longing imprisoned in the stone vaults of theology, the heart still found a secret passage out. In the great castles of southern France, where the sound of the lute drifted through banquet halls, a new kind of love was born, courtly love, a love that could only exist in imagination, in poetry, in the space between two glances. It seems a contradiction, yet it bloomed from the strictest chains. When the flesh was condemned, nobles sought salvation in a pure, incorporeal affection. They loved through song, through glances across a feast, through letters hidden in sleeves, and because they could not touch, their love became sacred. The impossibility of possession made it burn brighter. The man was often a knight, the woman another man's wife. He swore fidelity to her as to God, not to possess but to revere. In a world where every act of flesh was suspect, language became new skin. Poetry became touch that did not sin. The troubadours of Provence filled their verses with roses never plucked, and streams seen but never entered. Desire, denied, turned to art, exquisite and cruel. Courtly love was not for everyone. It was a privilege of the upper world, those rich enough to dream. For peasants, love was labour and hunger. For nobles, it was play of the soul. Yet within that game lay a quiet revolution. For the first time, a woman was celebrated as something to worship, not to own. The lady, La Dame, rose to near divinity, distant yet radiant. The knight knelt, and in his kneeling she ruled. A beautiful paradox. The prisoner became the goddess. But beneath its polished beauty, this love bore the same wound as its age. It freed no one, it only refined captivity. The knight practiced devotion as discipline. The lady learned endurance as grace. Every sigh, every glance rehearsed perfection. Too far, and they sinned. Too little, and they ceased to feel. The result was a moral ballet, pain raised to the level of art, and therein lay its quiet rebellion. Courtly love defied the church not through sin but through suffering. The more it hurt, the holier it seemed, the more it lacked, the purer it became. Love became a way to survive a world that hated the body, so loving without it. It was born of guilt, yet sheltered by culture. Picture it, a candlelit banquet, the gentle plucking of a lute, laughter echoing off marble walls. The husband speaks with a bishop. His wife, in her long gown, tilts her head toward a knight across the room. No words, only silence thick with meaning. That was courtly love, alive in the breath between two sentences. It was also the nobility's way of reassuring itself, that love could remain pure if untouched. But people are people. Many such romances escape their verses, from Lancelot and Queen Guinevere to Tristan and Isolde. Condemned by priests, they lived on in poems because they voiced what the age most feared, that the soul and the body longed together. Historically, courtly love marked a turning point. Women, once blamed as the source of sin like Eve, became muses, moral stars guiding courage and virtue. From this ideal came the lady and knight, the roots of Europe's romantic tradition. Flawed as it was the first whisper that love could be a spiritual journey, not just a marital duty. Yet it all existed within illusion. When a knight sang of his lady, he sang not to her, but to the image society allowed him to desire. When she received his verse, she was forbidden to answer, only to blush. Its beauty lay in its impossibility, and its endurance lay in restraint. Like all things medieval, courtly love was both awakening and disguise. It let people admit desire, as long as they renamed it virtue, devotion, service. Love was lifted above the flesh, yet never far from it, like incense in a chapel, fragrant, holy and still smoke. Perhaps courtly love was the Middle Ages' most delicate rebellion, a silent way to love when touch was forbidden, to ache without confession. And so, in a world where every pleasure was sin, love itself became art. But if the noble castles were where love was bound in poetry, the monastery was where it was imprisoned in silence. Outside, knights sang of purity trembling before desire. Inside, behind walls of cold stone, hundreds buried themselves alive so they would never again hear the beating of their own hearts. And in that effort to extinguish all longing, they heard it more clearly than ever. To enter a medieval monastery was to step into a world drained of colour. Everything was reduced to essence. Coarse robes, bland meals, sparse speech. They ate, slept, and prayed to the rhythm of church bells. Steady, repetitive, eternal. Time moved not by the sun but by scripture. Yet within that sacred rhythm were moments when the flesh remembered itself. The monks and nuns lived apart from the world, but the world never truly left them. At night, when the bell tolled in the distance, when a companion's breath stirred beside them, when a sleeve brushed another during prayer, they felt something the Bible did not teach, that life within them still demanded to live. Records from the 13th and 14th centuries tell of confessions that went beyond ritual. Souls sought one another for solace, and sometimes confession turned into confession of another kind. It is said that on cold winter nights nuns drew near for warmth, and warmth somehow became something else. Their letters, full of tenderness, blur the line between sacred and human love. The Church never admitted it, but denial made it more real. In an age when every feeling had to be rephrased as the will of God, desire became a tragedy of silence. They loved secretly, believing their love still pure, because it rose upward, not downward, a faith both innocent and desperate, that by loving in the name of the soul, they might redeem the body. One German nun, whose journal was later seized by ecclesiastical court, wrote, "I felt the presence of God in her breath. It was not blasphemy, it was honesty." For those taught to despise their own flesh, the only way to accept desire was to baptize it in holiness. They did not call it love, they called it grace. They did not name pleasure, they called it divine communion. In truth, the monastery never destroyed desire, it distilled it. When all else was stripped away, only awareness remained, and in awareness every emotion rang louder. Many monks entered ecstasy, ecstasis, during prayer. The famous vision of St. Teresa, pierced by the divine spear, is the perfect emblem of how the medieval mind merged the erotic and the sacred into a single flame. The line between a soul touched by God and a body aroused grew thinner than hair. In men's monasteries, younger priests confessed to their elders. It was meant to be supervision of the spirit, yet within that intimacy, tangled affections often took root. The Inquisition records speak of abuses of confession, of those who turned ritual into domination or solace. But behind the scandal one sees not monsters, only lonely human beings seeking warmth. Loneliness was the great haunting of the cloister. When you live too long in silence, every breath becomes a noise. When you pray too long, every pause becomes a question. Does God still hear me? And when there is no answer, you begin to listen to each other, with every sense you have left. The outer world called it sin, but within many believed it to be a sacred communion. They found God not on the altar, but in another's eyes, and that frightened them, for they had been taught that God could be reached only by denying the self. The monastery, in its deepest meaning, was the ultimate experiment, testing faith against instinct, a laboratory of the spirit where one measured how long belief could resist the pulse of blood. But when suppression lasts too long, even breath becomes confession. Ancient records describe strange punishments. A nun forced to sleep on stone for sharing a bed. A priest transferred for prolonged confession. The verdicts never say more, but everyone understood. It was the price of feeling in a world that feared emotion as heresy. Perhaps the medieval monastery was the purest paradox of its time, a refuge from the body, yet the place where the body was felt most acutely. Amid stone walls and chanting, they learned to hold their breath to forget, only to hear more clearly the whisper of blood. And in that silence, sometimes so faintly, they loved one another, not with flesh, nor with speech, but through presence itself, a love unpermitted yet persistent, like a candle trembling in a cold monastery, burning just enough to remind them that even saints are still human. And perhaps, When breath had been held too long within the monastery walls, it had to find another way out, onto the edge of the page. There, among the men who copied scripture day after day, beneath the dim oil light and the scent of parchment and leather, trembling hands began to write not only the words of God, but also the things he never said. From the margins, the marginalia, medieval monks let their souls slip through the cracks of holiness, and for the first time in centuries allowed themselves to smile. Picture it. A monk bent over a wooden desk, his eyes stinging from hours of tracing solemn Latin. Around him, silence. Only the soft rasp of quill on vellum. And then, at the bottom of the page where no one would look, he draws a rabbit spearing a knight, or a monkey in a friar's robe preaching to geese. Not a joke, but a breath. The exhale of a human being confined too long within rules. These small drawings, what we now call marginalia, decorate the edges of Bibles, missals, and books of prayer. Yet it is those edges that reveal the truest soul of the age. Look closely, and you'll find another world unfurling within the church's own pages. Birds that talk, priests chased by pigs, nuns plucking forbidden fruit, and sometimes winged phalluses gliding through the air like mythic creatures of mischief. Why did they draw them? Because somewhere between devotion and exhaustion, humans need to laugh. In a world where desire was sin and laughter irreverence, a rabbit with a sword was rebellion enough. No shouting, no blood, just a flick of ink to remind the universe that the spirit was not yet broken. Marginalia was where religion and instinct met in silence. While the main text praised God, the margins told stories of man. On some pages you find drunken friars or mice capturing cats. Simple jokes that turn into parables. The world inverted. Perhaps the monks were whispering to us. However sacred the order, life underneath it still teemed and wriggled. Miraculously, no one erased them. For centuries, marginalia lived beside holy text, as though the church either did not see or quietly forgave. Maybe they knew that even saints need a corner to breathe. And in truth, these sinful doodles let us feel the human pulse beneath the robes of men who seemed made of stone. Think of it. Those who spent their lives copying the word of God, yet when unobserved drew cats riding fish or nuns picking apples, not out of blasphemy, but out of hunger to touch what was human again. In the cold of the scriptorium, ink became warmth. In silence, laughter drawn by quill became prayer. Some scholars call marginalia the art of the oppressed. When the pen could not wander in meaning, it wandered in margins. These monks could not say, "I am weary," or "I find this absurd," so they drew it through satire and inversion. And in their mischief lay a sharp, nearly existential wisdom that sometimes, to keep one's faith, one must be allowed to laugh at it. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the drawings grew more daring, bawdy, surreal, almost tender in their defiance. Flying phalluses, nuns planting vegetables, priests chased by roosters, obscene yet strangely compassionate. Because beneath the vulgarity was not mockery, but a sigh. We are human too. In a world where desire was punished, the act of drawing it, even on the edge of a page, was an act of courage. What made marginalia remarkable was its tone. It spoke through smiles, not sermons. It did not renounce God. It simply questioned fear. It did not deface scripture. It whispered beside it, "Does God truly hate laughter?" And that question even now has no answer. Today, when we look at those small sketches, the rabbit with a sword, the man riding a snail, the nun plucking forbidden fruit, we see a secret universe of quiet rebellion. a world of souls forced into solemnity, yet still carving freedom 1 millimeter at a time. And in those awkward, fragile lines of ink we realise the medieval spirit was never entirely lost to darkness. It merely hid itself in the margins. Perhaps when a monk wrote the final period of his Bible, he looked up at the dying candle and smiled. For somewhere along the edge of the page his little rabbit still ran, alive, unbound, laughing. And so, through the long silence of the Middle Ages, marginalia was the laughter of an entire civilization, not spoken but written in ink, small, mischievous, and enduring enough to outlive the darkness that birthed it. After the monks had finished their quiet laughter in the margins of Scripture, the world beyond those cloisters began to loosen its own breath. The stern solemnity of religion could not imprison the body forever, just as ink could not contain a laugh. Out there, among market squares and smoke-stained villages, people discovered a place where faith and sin called a truce, the public bathhouse. Not a cathedral, not a confessional, but a room of steam and warmth, where breath mingled and faces, whether noble or poor, flushed the same red. Medieval bathhouses, especially in France, Germany and Bohemia, were small universes of humanity. They were places of washing, gathering and remembering that one still had a body. In a world that preached flesh as corruption, to strip off clothing and sink into warm water was not mere hygiene. It was ritual, a ritual of return without priests, without scripture, only steam and laughter. You step inside. The wooden door creaks, a wave of heat kisses your face. The air smells of herbs, of pine wood, sometimes of wine. The blacksmith, the weaver, the knight, and the lady sit together in the same bath. Naked, crownless, equal. For a brief moment all boundaries dissolve. Everyone is simply human, with the same skin, the same heartbeat, the same exhaustion. To the medieval mind, the bathhouse was both dangerous and divine. Preachers warned that it was a place where the devil whispers through steam, and perhaps they were right. Warm water makes people forget sin. There, smiles came easier than prayers. Accidental touches no longer felt forbidden but instinctive. Many lovers first met in the bathhouse, and when they emerged they spoke to each other as if they had already confessed before God. By the 13th and 14th centuries, thousands of public baths flourished across Europe. Some were lavish as palaces, walls painted with scenes of Eden, musicians playing lutes, taverns adjoining with wine and laughter. People did not only cleanse their skin, they bathed in the feeling of being alive. After days encased in wool, sweat and guilt, the body was freed, floating again in the warmth of its own nature. The irony is that many of these bathhouses were operated by monasteries. The same institutions that preached restraint also sold release. A perfect medieval paradox. Every prohibition came with an escape hatch. A priest could preach that the body was sin, then quietly descend to the baths to purify the soul. In poems and woodcuts, the bathhouse appears as the borderland between purity and pleasure. You see couples half-veiled by steam, shoulders glistening, eyes meeting. You see allegories of the Godder washing the soul, though everyone knew what that meant. The same people who were told to despise their bodies could not look away from them when they shimmered behind vapour. Bathing, in a way, was how the Middle Ages made peace with itself. Outside, the pulpit divided the world into clean and unclean, holy and profane. But inside the bath no one cared. The man let go of his cross. The woman untied her veil. Both sighed as if saying, "At last, I am alive again." Of course, the church did not yield for long. By the 15th century, as plague spread, bathhouses were denounced as breeding grounds of disease and sin. They were closed in the name of health, but really it was control, for in a society sustained by fear, even the touch of another, through heat, through breath, was a threat. Yet the image of the bathhouse never vanished. It haunted European art and folklore, a memory of a time before shame, when water cleansed not guilt but dust. For a brief chapter in history, warm water replaced sin, and human warmth replaced confession. If marginalia were the monk's secret laughter, then the bathhouse was the people's open laughter, and they laughed with their whole bodies. There were no sermons, no hierarchies, only the sound of splashing water and shared mirth. Perhaps in that misty air, medieval people unknowingly rediscovered what religion had tried to erase: the feeling of being alive, warm and touchable. In the end, the medieval bathhouse was more than a place of washing. It was a place where prejudice was briefly rinsed away. Beneath the foam and vapour, nobles and peasants, saints and sinners, all dissolved into one human shape, and when they stepped out again, shivering, solemn once more, it was as if they had re-armoured themselves, concealing their humanity until the next bath. For after all, amid 1,000 prohibitions, the medieval world still found ways to love, to live, to laugh, in secret. And sometimes, all it took was a breath of steam to remember that sin was never in the flesh, but in forgetting that we have flesh. When the steam of the bathhouses faded and people returned to their clothes, their scriptures, their boundaries, they began to fear the very thing they had just touched: nature. For between pleasure and sin there is only a breath's width, and when intimacy with the body had already made them uneasy, intimacy with the natural world terrified them. From that fear, medieval Europe entered one of the strangest chapters in its legal history, the animal trials. It sounds like farce, but it was real. Pigs, goats, oxen, dogs, even roosters were summoned before courts, given defence lawyers, formal indictments, and sentences of death. Everything was done with grave seriousness, as though these creatures bore human souls. Why? Because people believed that if the line between man and beast blurred, the divine order would collapse. Order! That was the one fragile thread holding the world together. Above, God. Below, man. Then beasts, plants, stones, any act that inverted that ladder. Copulating with animals, or even treating them with excessive familiarity, was seen as an insult to creation itself. It stirred a deeper dread. That man, made in the image of God, might slip backward into wilderness. From the 13th to the 15th centuries, hundreds of such trials were recorded across Europe. A pig executed for carnal sin with its master. A horse hanged for being possessed by the devil. Sometimes the verdict began with a prayer and ended with a burning. A dreadful blend of law, superstition, and instinctive fear. The horror was not in the killing itself, but in the reason behind it. In a world without science, where disease was thought the devil's breath, where pigs might speak and stars mirrored God's moods, execution was not punishment, but reassurance. A ritual to remind mankind, we are still different. The surviving records expose a collective anxiety, a terror of losing boundaries. When peasants slept in barns beside their livestock, when cold winters made them share warmth with goats or oxen, when bathhouses had blurred flesh from flesh, the separation between human and animal grew thin, and each time the line wavered, society answered with violence, a sacrament of fear disguised as justice. Those trials, absurd as they sound, were ceremonies of panic. Judges wore robes, priests raised crucifixes, and sentences were spoken in trembling voices, not out of rage, but out of dread. They were not purging animals, but exorcising themselves. For deep down they knew, The demon they feared was not in the field, but in their blood. Some trials chill even now. In 1457, a sow and her 6 piglets were charged with killing a child. The mother was found guilty and hanged. The piglets were acquitted for being too young to know sin. A lawyer defended them. A prosecutor condemned. The townsfolk watched as if attending mass. The act was not about justice, but survival of belief that divine law still governed chaos. The cruel irony was this: the more humans feared beasts, the more beastly they became. Their violence was the shadow of their order. Anything that strayed beyond the proper form, a body, a gesture, a thought, was burned. Only fire could convince them the border still held. Modern readers often laugh at these cases, but look closer and the comedy melts into tragedy. They reveal a world that punished every deviation with blood, to defend a fragile illusion that humanity stood above nature. And in doing so, it estranged itself from nature more completely than ever. How strange. In trying to prove they were higher than animals, medieval people exposed their most primal terror, the fear of becoming one again, a fear that never died, only changed masks, from the pigs hanged in the 15th century to the witches burned in the 16th. And so, amid the smell of smoke and the tolling of church bells, those strange trials echo still, a reminder that every civilization is built upon fear. Fear of blood, fear of desire, fear of nature, fear of the wildness within. And yet it was fear that gave birth to law, to ritual, to faith. Walls of words and belief erected to keep the inner night from spilling outward. Each time an animal burned and a scream rose above the square, the crowd exhaled with relief. Order restored, the world intact, until the fire died and only the stench of flesh remained. Then perhaps in the crowd, a peasant or a young priest, someone might think, if God made the beasts, does he watch us burn them? No one dared answer, but that question lingered, faint as smoke drifting through a winter morning of the 15th century, when humankind, trembling between nature and faith, tried to convince itself it was something more than animal. When humanity had firmly declared that beasts were beneath, there remained only one other creature to subdue in order to preserve the order of God, the woman. And so, Europe descended into a collective delirium that lasted more than 2 centuries, the age of witch hunts. At first, no one imagined that a few peasant women could shake the foundations of theology. But as plagues spread, harvests failed, and darkness thickened, the world needed a scapegoat, someone to bear its misfortunes, and the woman, with her mysterious body, her power to give life, and her quiet hunger, became the perfect vessel for the devil. They consort with Satan, the accusations cried across Europe. They fly naked through forests, conjure storms, kill infants, and poison wells. No evidence, only rumour, fevered dreams, and the twisted imagination of a world haunted by its own repressed desire. Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, published in 1486, became the manual for hunting and burning them. Written by 2 Dominican friars, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, it gathered every medieval obsession about women into one accusation. Woman is weak of mind, greedy of flesh, and therefore the favourite instrument of the devil. On each page, desire became sin, longing became covenant. The female body, once celebrated as the source of life, was now the portal to damnation. Every pulse of lust, every dream, every wandering glance could be taken as proof. Those accused were seldom guilty of anything but existing outside the mould. Too beautiful, too clever, too old, or too poor. They were dragged into squares, bound with ropes, tested with water or iron. If she floats, the devil has saved her. If she drowns, God has vindicated her. Either way she died. The only difference was the name of the death. They burned these women not because they were evil, but because they made men afraid of themselves. Each scream in the flames was the echo of a civilization terrified of its own body. When flesh became sin, its owner became the devil incarnate. Tragically, the witch hunts did not rage in the shadows of ignorance, but in the heart of European Christendom. From Germany to France, from Switzerland to the Low Countries, under church spires and in market squares, hundreds of thousands were hanged, drowned, or burned for lying with demons. By then the fear of beasts had been replaced by the fear of women, and fire no longer burned bodies. It burned imagination itself. For when a society begins to kill its dreamers, it grows cruel and stupid. Modern scholars call it a moral panic, but truly, it was the greatest gendered hysteria in history. Unable to accept that desire lived in everyone, people chose to burn those who reminded them of it. If you look closely, the witch trials were a grotesque ritual of purification, one that burned the wrong target. Not the devil was consumed, but humanity itself, in its desperate attempt to wash away desire. Not because the accused had done evil, but because they had made others think of evil. Some confessions sound almost surreal. Women swearing that they flew through forests, lay with fiery demons, drank blood from bone cups, but under torture, anyone will say anything, especially if it means dying sooner. And each confession fed the next fire. It was an age drunk on smoke and sanctimony. Fires rose in the name of purity, but what burned was the soul of Europe, scorched by its own terror. Malleus Maleficarum thus stands not as a book of demons, but a mirror, reflecting an era where faith, desire, and cruelty fused into poison. Human beings forgot how to tell salvation from punishment, purity from savagery. Perhaps the most terrifying thing was not the fire, but the calm of those who watched it. Faces lit by flames, faces that had once loved, prayed, trembled beneath a woman's smile, now watched her burn, believing it righteous. For in that time, when people had learned to destroy everything that frightened them, only ashes remained real. And in those ashes, if you listen, you can still hear the whisper of the women they called witches. We were burned only because we lived differently. When all strangeness had been silenced in the fire, Europe believed it had purged the chaos of desire, but the ashes were still warm, and from them rose souls that refused to submit, beings who walked between borders, neither holy man nor holy woman. They did not fly through forests as the priests imagined. They simply stepped beyond gender, and that alone was heresy. If witches embody the world's fear of womanhood, then those who transcended gender embodied its deeper dread, the fear of a trembling order. Medieval thought insisted that all things stood in their divinely fixed place. Men with swords, women with brooms, men preaching, women praying. So when anyone crossed that line, a woman in armour, a man in a gown, the entire cosmos seemed to shudder. Joan of Arc was that shudder made flesh, a peasant girl who heard the voice of God, donned armour, raised a banner, and led France to battle. To the people she was miracle, to the church she was holy inconvenience. For if God could speak through a woman, then the words of men lost their claim to authority. And when the fire rose beneath her in Rouen, it was not merely her body they burned, it was the idea that gender could ever be crossed. But Joan was not alone. Across Europe lived the female husbands, women who passed as men, married wives, worked, fought, and died in their chosen roles. Some were only discovered after death, leaving townsfolk stunned. And in small villages, carnival days blurred the world for one brief moment. Men wore dresses, women wore armour, laughter hid trembling truth. For one day each year, the world dared to test its own foundations and glimpse a freedom it could not name. Those who defied gender did more than change clothes. They defied theology itself. If one could be both man and woman, or neither, then where had God drawn his lines? If the body was fluid, how could sin of the flesh be fixed? They became living paradoxes, proof that humanity was far too complex for doctrine, and so they too were punished, shaved, exiled, executed, or simply erased. Yet between the lines of records one senses an uneasy respect, as if even their judges knew these souls were braver than themselves. In truth, the idea of gender transcendence was never new. The Bible spoke of eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven. Mystics describe divine androgyny, beings bearing both light and shadow. But in the Middle Ages that ancient harmony was twisted into sin. Folk tales, however, remembered differently. They whispered of girls who rode like knights, of boys who danced like goddesses, not with mockery but with wonder. For ordinary people, unlike theologians, understood that these were simply souls trying to live honestly in a world that forbade honesty. The tragedy of those who crossed genders was that they lived in a time with no language for themselves. No non-binary, no trans, no identity. They could only live, quietly, defiantly, or beautifully, and let others guess. But that wordless existence made them symbols, spirits slipping through the cracks of history. And through those cracks, humanity glimpsed itself anew. Every civilization believes it knows what man, woman, nature, and sin mean, until someone steps outside them. When they do, all definitions tremble. Perhaps if Joan had lived, she would not have called herself feminist, or androgynous, or saint. She was simply a person who heard a voice inside and dared to follow it. And that, her truth, made her more dangerous than any witch, for she was not led by demons, but by honesty. When they burned her, it was not only hair that smoked, but the fear of a world that could not bear freedom without permission. As the flames rose and prayers mumbled, history, as always, fell silent. But the fire never truly went out. It slipped into folklore, into masked festivals, into the glances of those born outside the mould. In the end, those who crossed the boundaries of gender were the truest living souls, for they knew there was no need to choose between light and shadow, male and female, saint and sinner. They simply were, and they lived the forbidden half of life for the rest of us. Perhaps that is why, in Europe's long dream, between the ashes of witches and the smoke of wars, the faint figure of Joan still rides through the mist, a short-haired girl in armour, banner in hand, riding between two worlds, belonging to neither, and burning still, but only with light. When those who had crossed beyond gender vanished into the church's smoke and the forgetfulness of history, Europe returned to its old order, where men and women were restored to their proper places, at least on paper. But every order requires a fracture to survive, and within that fracture another world quietly breathed, the red light district. There, no one spoke of sanctity, and no one asked about gender. There, the body was not sin but commodity, livelihood, and the most naked truth of the Middle Ages. The narrow streets around the churches where candlelight trembled in the windows once formed the fragile border between sin and duty. By day, priests preached chastity. By night, they walked through the alleys where prostitutes waited, not in rebellion against God, but because even the church knew a city without sex workers is a dangerous city. For when desire finds no outlet, it seeps into the sacred. And so the paradox bloomed, brothels sanctioned by religion. In Paris, in Avignon, in Venice, prostitutes paid taxes, they attended mass, confessed their sins, even received indulgences if they worked within permitted quarters. Mayors, bishops and noblemen all knew those places well and treated them as safety valves for society. Historians call it the system of moral tolerance, but in truth it was not tolerance. It was a compromise between ideal and instinct. Medieval Europe could not destroy lust, so it chose to regulate it. The Church declared the body sinful, yet built a machinery to keep that sin orderly. As for the women in those quarters, they were not treated as people, but as public property. They lived apart, dressed apart, and were forbidden from joining communal worship. In 14th century Florence, the law required prostitutes to wear yellow veils, so all could recognize them. In Nuremberg, they could only leave their streets at designated hours. Their bodies belonged to the city, but their souls belonged to no one. And within that isolation lay a quiet paradox. They were called impure, yet they sustained the morality that condemned them. Because of them, wives preserved their honour, priests their sanctity, and gentlemen their respectability. Everyone needed them. No one admitted it. Yet in old confessions one finds something unexpected. Many prostitutes were more honest, even more devout than their clients. They knew themselves as sinners, but never pretended otherwise. They prayed, they confessed, they paid their dues, living within the lines society drew, and sometimes showing more mercy than those who preached repentance. A 15th century priest once wrote, "These women may be defiled in flesh, but purer in heart than those who sin without knowing." It was one of the rare sentences of true compassion in an age of iron faith. Perhaps the red light district was the only place in the Middle Ages that came close to truth. There, every illusion about soul and body dissolved. Amid sweat, wine, and candle wax, no one spoke of God or guilt, only of price. Yet in that bareness was something deeply human, the admission that all are weak, all crave, all need another's touch to know they are still alive. Many prostitutes, when they grew old, were buried beyond the cemetery walls, in soil reserved for souls not pure enough. But sometimes someone left a flower on their graves, not out of pity, but in recognition that they too belonged to the city, to life, to the shared sin that bound everyone together. It is a bitter irony. Cast into the city's hidden streets, they became its most truthful dwellers. They hid nothing, performed nothing. They sold the body but not the soul. They knew the cost of flesh and the worth of kindness. Perhaps, if someone looked down from above, a saint or a weary god, they would see that those called unclean, under the dim lamps of the medieval night, were the ones living truest to the nature he gave, neither holy nor damned, but real. And perhaps, in his eyes, they were already forgiven, for they never lied about who they were. And then, when the red light streets dimmed and the candles went out, when laughter and footsteps dissolved into mist, the medieval city returned to the stillness it had always desired. Above, the dark towers of the churches folded like clasped fingers, and the night bells began to toll. The sound drifted through rooftops, shutters, and narrow lanes, like the breath of God, or perhaps a lullaby from a world grown tired. From prostitute to priest, from penitent to sinner, everyone lay under the same darkness. No laws, no doctrines, only the steady breathing of thousands sinking into sleep. Bodies trembling beneath coarse blankets, hands searching for one another in the cold, whispered prayers no one would ever hear. There were no angels judging, no demons lurking, only human beings, frail, yearning, and true. Perhaps this was the only moment when flesh and soul became one, no longer opposed as holy and lustful, saved and damned. When night fell, all returned to their first instinct, the hunger to touch, to love, to rest. No one longed for heaven or absolution anymore. They only wished for a bit of warmth to forget the chill sinking into their skin. The sermons of daylight said the body was fleeting and the soul eternal. But when night came, even the priest knew. The soul cannot pray if the body has not slept. Sleep, in its deepest sense, was the great erasure of borders between sin and grace, between God and man. In the wooden houses, breaths mingled with the wind. Somewhere a woman prayed softly, her fingers brushing a crucifix, while the man beside her dreamed of that same hand resting on his shoulder. In a monastery, monks drifted into slumber on straw mats, lips still murmuring prayers. And in the red light quarter, women exhausted from long nights closed their eyes, and perhaps, in dreams, found forgiveness. No one escapes the night, but the night condemns no one. It shelters saints and sinners alike, as if God, or darkness itself, had decreed that in sleep all souls are equal. A philosopher of that age once wrote, "Sleep is a temporary death, but the truest form of life. For only with closed eyes do humans stop lying to themselves. In sleep there are no titles, no weddings, no original sin or judgment, only heartbeat, breath, and memories fading like smoke." If there were one image to end the Middle Ages, it would not be the cross or the flame, but a city asleep. Under timbered roofs, within stone cloisters, at forest edges and in brothels, thousands sleeping the same dream. A cold sleep, but peaceful, heavy, yet honest. For in the end, all debates over flesh and soul, sin and faith lead to one truth. Every human being is only seeking a bit of warmth to believe they have not been forsaken. Perhaps God understands that best. For if he ever lived as man, he too knew loneliness in the night, shivered from cold, and longed for the nearness of another breath. And maybe, in that instant, God and desire were not opposites, but two ways of reaching the same thing, love. So when the night bells ring, you might imagine all of Europe breathing as one. Doctrines dissolve like mist, sins are cleansed by silence. And in that fragile moment between shadow and moonlight, the body sleeps and the soul prays. A world closes not with war or blood, but with the final quiet breath of those who only wish to be loved, even if only in dreams. Human beings have never ceased to wrestle between two poles, the soul and the body, faith and instinct, God and the self. From the cold stone monasteries to the red-lit alleys, from the sermons whispered over pulpits to the quiet breathing in the dark, people of that age were not so different from us. They were simply trying to live truthfully in a world that demanded they pretend. What makes that history unforgettable is not its cruelty or its gloom, but the persistence of humanity, the way people still found tenderness amid suffering. They were bound by the church, by kings, by fear, yet they still knew how to love, to desire, to forgive. They sinned to stay alive and prayed to be forgiven, and within that endless circle of sin and redemption lies a simple truth. No one in that history was ever truly wrong. They were only reaching for the light in their own way. So when you listen to these stories, do not see only darkness. See in them a mirror. Every age has its invisible prisons, its old beliefs, its imposed standards, its voices that make us afraid of ourselves. The Middle Ages are not merely the past. They are a metaphor for the present. Each time we feel ashamed of our own emotions, we're still living in a church that has not yet fallen. But if history teaches us anything, it is that no prison lasts forever. For even when forced to pray, people still knew how to love. Even when bound by dogma, they still dared to dream. And if they, in an age of fire, blood and fear, could still keep a little gentleness for one another, then so can we. So tonight, when you turn off the light, remember, weakness is not sin. The body is not a burden. The soul need not be perfect. They need only to live together as they once did. And in the slow breath before sleep takes you, be grateful that you live in a time where you are allowed to be yourself without needing to confess for it.